December 23, 1944. The sky over the Ardennes finally cleared. For days, a low, iron-gray ceiling had blanketed the forest, muffling the roar of engines and keeping Allied air power grounded. That morning, the clouds parted like a curtain, and the Allied fighters that had been waiting took to the air in waves. From his command post along a frozen lane, Sepp Dietrich watched columns of German armor and trucks, once the proud spearheads of a last desperate gamble, become a long, slow row of targets. He would later describe the sound, the metallic, continuous ripping of bullets and ordnance as it tore through fuel cans, soft tops, and the still-smoking hulks of armored cars. It was, for him and for many of his colleagues, the instant when a hope that had been loudly proclaimed in Berlin was reduced to charred steel and fuel-stained snow. Dietrich's reaction, recalled after the war, was not the high rhetoric of victory. It was a scornful, exhausted acknowledgement. The offensive, as conceived, could no longer be made to work. That moment, clear skies, Allied planes, stalled columns, is the hinge of the Ardennes story. It is where operational reality snapped the brittle thread of strategic fantasy. To understand why men like Dietrich, Walter Model, and Gerrit von Rundstedt reacted the way they did requires stepping back a week, to the outset of the offensive, to the confident language in Hitler's briefing, and the fragile assumptions that underwrote the plan. On December 16, 1944, German forces surged west from the Ardennes in the early hours of what was intended to be the last great offensive on the Western Front. Adolf Hitler had conceived a bold, politically charged objective, a thrust to Antwerp that would split the Allied lines, force the Western Allied command in chaos, and, in his own words to the inner circle, open the door to negotiations favorable to Germany. The rhetoric in the Führer's headquarters left no room for half measures. Antwerp or nothing, the order implied. Anything less would be failure. Yet the plan that left the briefing rooms and filtered down the chain of command was not matched by the logistics that planners could actually guarantee. Operational staff had calculated the sheer scale of what would be required. Armored thrusts consume fuel and spares by the ton. For the Bulge operation, estimates suggested fuel needs that the German supply system could not meet without outside help. Some contemporary figures cited a shortfall measured in millions of gallons, on the order of needing roughly 5 million gallons to sustain the pace Hitler demanded, while available stocks and reachable captured supplies amounted to perhaps 2 million gallons at best. Those numbers did not take into account the ever-present risks of losing captured depots to counterattacks or airstrikes, nor the attrition of fuel in moving supply trains over icy and congested roads. There were other constraints, equally unforgiving.
The Ardennes offered narrow lanes carved through dense woods. The main routes of advance were little more than single-track highways hemmed in by trees. When mechanized divisions met oncoming traffic or damage to a bridge, the only choices were to squeeze past slowly, to turn back, or to gamble on the terrain. Snow and ice made the little roads treacherously slick. Engineers and drivers repeatedly reported deep ruts, frozen culverts, and bottlenecks that would choke the advance as effectively as any enemy. Crucially, the whole design of the offensive counted on bad weather to keep Allied air support grounded. The German High Command accepted a dependence on meteorology as though it were a military asset under their control, an assumption that would prove fatal when the clouds dispersed. At the outset, however, the opening days produced the kind of chaotic success that feeds hubris. Between December 16th and the 19th, German formations punched through American lines with a combination of surprise, local superiority, and the collapse of thinly held sectors. Towns were taken, roadblocks cleared, and thousands of prisoners were captured. Radio reports and frontline telegrams flowed back to Hitler's headquarters with tales of shock among American units, of armor cracking through and infantry advancing under the banner of a fresh offensive. Berlin seized on these dispatches as evidence that the gamble might yet pay. But the early euphoria masked a reality that was visible to commanders on the ground. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army and Hasse von Mantefel's 5th Panzer Army were achieving remarkable local successes, yet they were ravenous for fuel and spare parts. Vehicles soon outpaced supply columns. The deeper the penetration, the longer and more exposed the supply lines became. Captured American fuel dumps existed in theory as a remedy to the shortfall, but getting to them and keeping them was another matter. In many cases, the Germans found empty tanks or supplies already sabotaged or consumed by retreating Allied units, or destroyed by demolition squadrons. In other instances, fuel convoys were delayed by traffic jams or fell prey to counterattacks. The arithmetic of the campaign was unforgiving. For every kilometer gained, the price in fuel climbed geometrically. Then there was Bastogne. The crossroads town was an obstacle the Germans had not fully anticipated or accepted. When the encirclement of the American 101st Airborne and attached units stiffened, the story on both sides became defined by a small defiant reply that entered military lore. When German envoys demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAlefee, acting commander, repeatedly replied with a single word: nuts. That curt refusal encapsulated not merely tactical resilience, but the psychological reality the offensive faced, that local American defenses could be stubborn in ways that operational plans had to allow for.
The German timetable, already tight, did not have the cushion for the kind of time Baston's resistance demanded. Behind the operational struggles, differences in temperament and assessment among German leaders widened. Gerd von Rundstedt, the venerable commander of OB West, had from the outset been frank about his doubts. His skepticism was not rhetorical, but practical. Rundstedt's experience told him that the campaign's objectives were disproportionate to its means. He cautioned for a limited operation, an attempt to sever the Allied front along a narrow axis to secure better defensive positions, not to attempt to capture the vast prize of Antwerp, which would require sustaining supply lines well beyond what the Wehrmacht could guarantee. His reservations were not always voiced loudly in Berlin, where Hitler's confidence tended to carry the day in the conference room, but reserved dissent existed in the high command, an awareness that a measured aim would conserve resources and preserve forces for a protracted defense rather than exhaust them in a single politically motivated thrust. Walter Model, who held operational command in the critical zone of Army Group B, operated in the uncomfortable space between political orders and battlefield realities. Model was a soldier of the line, practical, focused on preserving units, and known for blunt assessments. He understood the nature of the terrain and the vulnerability of long armored columns on the Ardennes squeezed roads. In field reports, Model repeatedly warned of the consequences should weather permit Allied air power to reassert itself. He argued for preserving mobility and an exit plan rather than betting everything on achieving Antwerp. Model's skepticism was not pure pessimism, it was the product of an operational calculus. If supply lines could not be kept intact, then the armored spearheads would become static targets. Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel, the senior staff officers whose duties bound them to communicating between the field and the Führer, performed a difficult balancing act. Jodl's role as operations chief required him to translate the brutal realities of the front into a form the Führer would accept, while Keitel, as nominal chief of the OKW, frequently found himself in the role of formal conduit for Hitler's directives. Both men recorded facts in their reports, and both recognized the gulf between Hitler's grand objective and the supplies and routes available. Nevertheless, their public posture in meetings often aligned with the Führer's zeal. That alignment created a structural problem. The very people designed to inject realism into the decision-making process were constrained by the political dynamics of the inner circle. Those constrained realities were quickly apparent in the logistical thread that ran through the operation. Narrow roads and heavy traffic created choke points where a single damaged vehicle could halt a whole column.
When that happened, the fuel in the leading tanks did nothing to help those stuck behind. Men froze inside jammed convoys, while the clock on the offensive ticked mercilessly. Engineers tried to improvise repairs, build bypasses, and stretch thin logistical assets to cover unforeseen holes. But the basic facts remained. The deeper the push, the longer the supply lines, the more fragile the campaign became. And all the while, the weather was an uncontrollable variable hanging over every plan. For several days, the weather did their bidding. Low clouds kept Allied aircraft grounded, and the German forces could move with relative impunity. The Luftwaffe was not able to support the offensive decisively, but passage of the Allied air offensive depended on clear skies. The German staff planned around continuing low clouds, taking calculated risk that meteorology would remain favorable. Such a calculation is never sound betting in war. Weather is an enemy with no intentions, only effects. After the first block of rapid advances and tactical messaging to boost morale in Berlin, the cracks began to show in hard numbers and simple reports. Fuel consumption far outpaced stocks. Mechanical breakdowns multiplied as worn vehicles met icy roads. Captured fuel dumps were unreliable, and engineers and service troops struggled to keep supply lines open. The speed that had produced early success became the same speed that exposed the lack of a sustainable supply base. If these logistical and terrain factors had been the sole reason, the story might still be an operational tale of overreach, a textbook example of how logistics decides battles. But the moral and human dimensions, the reactions these events provoked among the German leadership, carried consequences of their own. By December 20 and 21, as shadows lengthened over the Ardennes and the first hints of supply difficulties were amplified by local American counterattacks and determined resistance at places like Bastogne, the tone in command rooms grew less certain. Field commanders who had celebrated early gains now sent back reports that bore the syntax of alarm: stalled columns, empty fuel cans, increasing vulnerability. The reports did not yet say the offensive was finished. They did, however, begin to urge more modest objectives and, quietly, contingency plans. This is where the human record becomes as important as the operational one. History often records the orders, the plans, and the technical assessments, and those are vital. But a campaign's turning point is also a psychological event. What did the commanders say to one another when the first columns were set alight? How did a veteran like Rundstedt reconcile street-level doubt with the public theater of obedience? How did Model marshal what energy he could into practical measures while trying not to directly contradict the Führer?
Documents and post-war recollections give us fragmented access to these states of mind, and those fragments tell a story of mounting private resignation at odds with the public demand for continued thrust. One of the most telling scenes took place not on the front, but in the interstices, the moment when a frontline commander, watching his own forces burn, recognized that no amount of exhortation from Berlin could alter the physical fact on the ground. Sepp Dietrich's testimony after the war, corroborated by officers in his staff, describes that precise instant when the air opened and Allied fighters began to work through the columns. Dietrich, always outwardly bold, became bitter. He did not recite victory slogans. He tallied loss. He and his staff acknowledged that the campaign had reached a point where continuation would mean annihilation of their mobile forces. That realization translated into sarcasm and a kind of world-weary candor, not the rhetorical flourish of a commander's communique, but the private, candid verdict spoken where a radio and a map table could not sanctify delusion. Dietrich's words, as recorded in post-war notes, were less an attempt at prophecy and more a brutal summation. The physical evidence on the ground had overtaken the political demand for glory. Hasso von Montiefel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, registered a similar exhaustion. Montiefel was a competent armored commander who had repeatedly warned about assuming logistical miracles. His reports, terse and with a soldier's economy of language, catalogued what restraint could still be evoked: pullbacks to defensible positions, consolidation of forces, and the preservation of what mechanized mobility remained. Such measures, however, would be interpreted in Berlin as timidity or even defeatism unless a clear political justification could be found. Model, who had responsibility for the entire operational area, faced the hardest calculation. He was in the position of reconciling orders that demanded bold thrusts with reports indicating that the offensive was fast becoming a liability. According to his staff papers and later interrogations, Model composed assessments that acknowledged the growing vulnerability. Fuel was running low, delays were compounding, and the Germans were becoming dependent on luck with the weather. In private conversations with subordinate commanders, Model pushed for a revised, smaller solution to consolidate gains and avoid the catastrophic loss of mobile reserves. Yet he was also a loyal officer who knew how orders flowed from the top. That conflict between sending a realistic appraisal upward and simultaneously presenting a face acceptable to the Führer is central to understanding the reaction of the High Command as a whole. Gerd von Rundstedt, for his part, escalated from quiet skepticism to a more explicit resignation. Rundstedt's stance was less dramatic than Model's in private. He did not rail.
He simply argued, with the gravity of a man who had seen campaigns before, that the whole enterprise was disproportionate to the means. He urged a limited objective, aimed at tactical advantage and a strategic posture better suited to what Germany could realistically sustain. It was a counsel rooted in economy and conservation, rather than in the grand illusion of a decisive break. Rundstedt's reaction was not a cry of betrayal, but a sober recalibration. If the offensive could not be supplied, preserve what you have for later fighting. Back in Berlin, Hitler continued to demand the spoils of the plan, insisting on Antwerp as the operational goal. The Führer's insistence was not merely a military statement, it carried political symbolism that made retreat politically charged. That symbolism constrained the behavior of Jodl and Keitel, both of whom were acutely aware of the operational problems, but also of the political theater in which they operated. Their memos and journal entries show them framing facts in terms that could be delivered to Hitler while trying to mitigate the worst consequences. Jodl would bring reports that stressed the need to maintain the drive while noting the tactical setbacks. Keitel would interpret and present those reports in council rooms with the formal language that preserved Hitler's dignity. That interplay explains why, even as Model and Rundstedt sought to inject realism, the radiating orders from Hitler's table remained uncompromising. The clearing of the skies on the morning of December 23rd altered the calculus in a tangible way. Allied fighters and fighter bombers, unleashed, began to interdict the columns and to target the logjam supply routes with brutal effectiveness. What had been transport corridors became death traps for logistics. Fuel drums exploded, fully fueled vehicles became incendiaries, and even armored vehicles found themselves vulnerable to air attack when immobilized by broken tracks or traffic. The resulting reports to command were suffused not only with tactical detail, but with an emotional register, frustration, disbelief, and a dawning recognition that the gamble could not be salvaged by will alone. When the High Command received those reports, reactions varied along a spectrum from bitter irony to practical resignation. Dietrich's bitter assessment was mirrored by Montefel's weary counsel. The offensive, in its present form, could not continue with catastrophic loss. Model, who had been preparing fallback plans, began to work those plans in earnest. Rundstedt, whose skepticism had been steady from the beginning, quietly wrote that the operation had overreached. Jodl and Keitel, responsible for transmitting information and advice to Hitler, found themselves funneling troubling facts into a meeting climate that insisted on optimism. High-level conferences in the days that followed took on the air of a slow-motion confrontation between two realities.
On one side were the numerical facts and operational reports. Empty fuel drums, blocked highways, burning convoys, and supplies that could not be secured. On the other side was a political objective that had already been publicly announced and that Hitler remained determined to pursue. In those councils, Jodl would present operational reports with a tone intended to be factual. Keitel would frame his remarks with the obedience expected of his office. Model and Rundstedt pushed back with insistence on preservation and practicality. The friction was not merely procedural, it was existential. The question was whether to preserve the last mobile formations for the defense of the Reich or to continue an assault that, if sustained, would leave those formations destroyed. One of the more unsettling features of these interactions was the dissonance between private candor and public posture. Model and Rundstedt, and even Dietrich and Montefel, began to speak privately of containment and withdrawal as practical necessities. In front of the Führer, the language changed. In private, the language became more honest. Part of the leader's reaction was thus a moral and psychological adjustment, to protect what remained by planning for retreat, rather than clinging to a strategy that only political necessity made mandatory. At the tactical level, American airmen that day simply did what their doctrine required: exploit the weather when it permitted them to do so. Fighter bombers attacked supply lines, strafed moving columns, and turned the narrow Ardennes roads into kill zones. The effect was both physical and demoralizing. A commander watches his best tanks burn not only as a loss of hardware, but as a loss of future options. For commanders whose identity and professional pride were bound up in maneuver warfare, watching mobility die under burning fuel drums and strafing aircraft was a kind of professional bereavement. The response was not dramatic theater, it was a hard, resignation-laced understanding that the campaign had slipped from achieving bold results to attempting to salvage what still remained serviceable. In those hours, the psychological economy of leadership changed. Where days earlier a meeting in the Führer's headquarters could be suffused with proclamations of destiny and plans for Antwerp, the conversation after the skies opened moved toward triage. The primary question shifted from how to push further west to how to avoid annihilation. That change in focus was visible in the report's Model composed and in the careful tone Rundstedt adopted. Even Jodl's operational language softened as he conveyed grim facts upwards. Keitel continued to perform the formal duties of his office, but the acquiescence that had once been almost reflexive became more clipped, suggesting a more constrained acceptance of the grim information being presented.
This is the human crux the title points to. What did German leaders do and say when the offensive failed an operational fact? Their reactions were not dramatic denunciations or explosive resignations. They were a mix of bitter irony, candid admission in private, and an increasingly urgent desire to salvage forces. The unbelievable aspect of their reaction was not that they wept or converted, it was that men steeped in military culture, trained to accept hard sacrifices for success, could not reconcile the political weight of Hitler's objective with the simple machine-like arithmetic of fuel, terrain, and air power. The smell of scorched rubber and oil that rose from the Ardennes lanes on December 23rd was the smell of a gamble that had been called by cold physical facts, not by personality. Yet even as the commanders privately acknowledged the operation's precariousness, the machinery of compliance did not stop. Orders still traveled along channels. Units still launched attacks in desperate attempts to seize fuel or to break through to key objectives. The conflict between doing what was necessary to preserve truce and doing what was demanded by command became more acute the more the German armies in the Ardennes bled into immobility. The scenes on the ground, frozen, burning vehicles, and stranded men, translated into an imperative in the high command: act now to prevent further irreversible losses. The immediate aftermath of the clear skies and the air interdiction is where the story pauses between strategic unraveling and operational decisions. Commanders like Model began to implement defensive measures and contingency plans with increasing urgency. Rundstedt's counsel for a limited solution seemed, in hindsight, to be the most plausible path to preserving what remained. Dietrich and Montiefel, from the front, signaled that continued thrusts without secure logistics would only multiply losses. Jodl and Keitel continued to navigate the delicate task of telling the Führer what was happening, while still trying to maintain order and morale. The Ardennes offensive had revealed, in compressed form, the fatal contradiction between an ideological strategic aim and the operational realities of modern mechanized warfare. It had also shown how leaders react when those contradictions become undeniable, not in dramatic revolts, but in private admissions, strategic recalibrations, and a slow shift from offensive intent to pragmatic preservation. The moment the sky cleared on December 23rd was the public, hard pivot in that process, the point where what had been hoped for could no longer be plausibly claimed. For Dietrich, Model, Rundstedt, Montiefel, Jodl, and Keitel, the day forced a reckoning whose consequences would echo through the remaining months of the war. If this episode grabs attention, it is partly because of the contrast, the grandiose language from the top and the grim arithmetic at the bottom.
If you want more of these deep military breakdowns, subscribe. There's a longer analysis waiting that follows how these reactions transformed command decisions in the days after December 23rd. From the moment the skies cleared, tactical events accelerated the confrontation between wishful aims and hard necessities. Allied aircraft did not merely puncture columns, they disrupted the fragile logistics that kept the German offensive alive. Reports came back of fuel trains ablaze and recovery vehicles overwhelmed. Mechanics who might have repaired damaged tanks could not reach them amid the confusion of bomb-cratered roads and blocked bridges. Soldiers improvised, attempted to strip fuel from wrecks, and in some cases abandoned intact vehicles that could not be extricated without fuel and time. The human toll of these decisions was reflected not in lurid battlefield scenes, but in the steady attrition of mobility and the moral exhaustion of commanders who watched the tools of their trade, tanks, trucks, trained crews, literally become inert. American reactions also fed into the German leaders' calculus. The defenders at Bastogne held. Patton's rapid redirection of forces westward to relieve the pocket was a calculated gamble that restored the strategic balance more quickly than German planners had anticipated. The nuts reply, while a small anecdote in operational terms, signified that local American leadership could resist panic and buy time. That time proved costly for the Germans. Each hour Bastogne held, and each day Patton's columns advanced, meant more attrition of German fuel stocks and more exposure to Allied air power. The operational elasticity of the German drive decreased by the hour. For men like Model, the mathematical fact was simple, even if politically unbearable. With constrained fuel, narrow lines, and increasing air interdiction, preserving mechanized reserves became the only rational choice. Yet withdrawing or significantly narrowing objectives meant acknowledging defeat at the level Hitler was unwilling to countenance. Thus, the leader's reaction oscillated between private realism and public obligation. Model and Rundstedt, in their private assessments and memos, increasingly used the language of contingency, fallback positions, phased withdrawals, conservation of armored units. Jodl and Keitel, responsible for carrying such assessments to the Führer, had to frame them in a manner that did not lead to immediate political wrath. That balancing act produced a waiting game in the council chambers, even as the front lines demanded immediate actions to prevent encirclement or total destruction. During those days, the correspondence and meeting notes show something that historians find both mundane and crucial: the progressive narrowing of options.
Where 5 days earlier the map had suggested multiple avenues for maneuver and a speculative prize in Antwerp, the map by December 23rd showed a constricted salient, with flanks vulnerable and supply lines that could be cut by concentrated attack or interdiction from the air. The numerical reality, numbers of tanks serviceable, miles of road surface passable, gallons of fuel available, began to determine strategy in a way that rendered ideological aims irrelevant. The leader's reaction shifted to reflect that new determinism. Talk of triumph dwindled into talk of avoidance of annihilation. It was in this shrinking of strategic possibility that bitterness and irony became evident among commanders. Dietrich's disdain was not only personal frustration, it embodied a professional judgment about the misuse of men and material. Rundstedt's quiet admission of prior doubt read like a lampoon of overreaching. Model's private computations were a function of a man trying to salvage coherence in the face of politically driven mandates.
Later interrogations and post-war memoirs capture these reactions without needing to construct dramatic dialogues. The record is in the memos, the altered orders, and the shifted troop dispositions. Leaders who had once argued for bold offensive sweeps now discussed the preservation of units as the primary mission. By the evening of December 23rd, the strategic picture had changed in ways that could no longer be denied. The days of optimistic communiques and telegrams celebrating local gains had given way to terse operational reports and urgent requests for rerouting and consolidation. The leadership's reaction to that change, a mixture of private incredulity, grudging acceptance, and calculated adjustments, would shape the immediate tactical decisions to come. The question that remained open, and that commanders faced in the hours that followed, was which course would be taken: a painful, staged withdrawal to save what was left, or stubborn continuation toward an objective that had swollen in political importance but shrank in military feasibility. The choices facing Germany's senior commanders at that moment were not merely technical decisions of supply and route. They were choices that touched on the moral calculus of preserving lives versus pursuing symbolic victory. The Ardennes offensive had been cast as a gamble. By December 23rd, its cost profile had become unacceptable to many who had once embraced the plan. The leaders' reactions, Dietrich's scorn, Model's guarded pragmatism, Rundstedt's steady skepticism, Mantefel's weary counsel, and the constrained posture of Jodl and Cadel, together form a tableau that historians return to not because of rhetorical flourish, but because of the truth they reveal: strategic hubris colliding with the immutable laws of logistics and weather, and human beings forced to reckon with the consequences.
The scene now shifts from the initial shock of the skies clearing to the practical, wrenching decisions that would follow in the days after December 23rd. Command posts filled with maps and ash-stained brushes of coffee, telephone lines crackled with reports of burning convoys, and commanders who had once spoken in terms of taking Antwerp were now drafting orders that looked suspiciously like withdrawal plans, contingency consolidations, and the reallocation of remaining armored units. The human register of their reaction, regret, irony, pragmatism, was the only honest language left to describe what had happened. What remains is to follow how those reactions translated into concrete orders and movements in the days that followed, how the 6th and 5th Panzer Armies attempted to extricate themselves, how Model tried to negotiate the fatal arithmetic of fuel and mobility, and how decisions taken in the high command shaped the final arc of the Ardennes gamble. Commanders on the ground moved from shock to action with the grim efficiency of men whose trade is improvisation under fire. Engineers, pressed into service as makeshift recovery crews, tried to pull disabled Shermans and Panthers from ruts so they could be siphoned for fuel. Maintenance units cannibalized wrecks to keep a single platoon running. Night after night, armored columns crept back along side roads, while artillery laid down smoke screens to hide movement from roving Allied fighters. Orders to seize enemy fuel depots became urgent, almost frantic. When those depots were found empty or sabotaged, the tone in the communiques turned bitter. Frontline commanders who had once been urged to outrun their logistics now issued instructions that read like retreat plans written sideways: hold what you can, deny more to the enemy, avoid encirclement. Model's staff, long used to working with a bleak operational calculus, moved quickly to translate the new reality into orders. Where the week before the map had been annotated with axes toward Antwerp, it was re-inked with fallback lines and designated rendezvous points for withdrawing armored units. Model did not shout. He wrote, calculated, and issued instructions to pare down assault elements, to conserve fuel for armored screens, and to organize staged withdrawals at the first sign that a spearhead could not be supplied. Those decisions were tactical and unsparing, to accept the loss of some ground in order to save formations that remained capable of maneuver. In private reports, he described the arithmetic plainly: the fuel consumption of an armored division, the attrition rates of vehicles, the time required to move support units over clogged roads, and his assessment left little room for the political rhetoric issuing from Berlin. Back in the Führer's conference rooms, the flow of bad news met established ritual. Hitler, still enthralled to the image of Antwerp as a decisive prize, insisted on sustained momentum.
Each time Jodl relayed operational detail, he phrased facts so they could be received without immediate rupture. He emphasized temporary setbacks and possible remedies. Keidel, who more than once had been reduced to carrying orders couched as compromise, performed his function with the mechanical loyalty for which posterity has judged him harshly. To those watching from outside the inner circle, such behavior read as denial. To those inside, it was the arithmetic of survival within a political system. Say enough to keep wrath at bay and try to buy time for adjustments on the map. It was a short-lived luxury. The devastation wrought by the cleared skies on December 23 forced concrete choices the next day. Reports came back of entire fuel convoys destroyed on the approaches to the main axes, of recovery vehicles shot or burned beyond use, and of tanks sitting idle when a single damaged track or an empty tank in front of them stopped an entire column. Montefel's dispatches, laconic and businesslike, began to instruct his regimental commanders to abandon deep pushes in favor of forming compact defensive ensembles, to use armor for local counterattacks only when fuel allowed, and otherwise to preserve crews and weapons for defense. Dietrich, whose 6th Panzer Army had borne the brunt of the initial thrust and then the punishment, communicated to his staff in language that post-war examiners would call candid. The offensive could not be continued without the near certainty of annihilating his best mobile units. Those candid assessments did not produce immediate unanimity at the top. They produced a different kind of pressure. Hitler feared that ordering a general withdrawal would be read as defeatism in Germany and among his allies, and he feared for the political consequences of abandoning the Antwerp goal after proclaiming it. He reacted predictably: insist, demand, and then attempt to micromanage local solutions. The effect was to produce contradictory orders at the field level, some elements told to withdraw to preserve forces, others still ordered to push towards objectives that no longer had logistical underpinning. That confusion increased losses rather than mitigating them. At this point, German staff officers had to make the unenviable choice between obeying a public, politicized command and heeding the operational facts. In private, Rensted repeated what he would later tell interrogators and historians: they had known the limits before the offensive began. He had argued from the outset that a scaled-down, limited operation would best serve the preservation of forces. Now those forces were in immediate peril. His tone in private communications shifted from counsel to urging of concrete withdrawals where those were still feasible. The decisions that followed were as much administrative as they were military.
The OKW and Army Group B began transferring elements away from the salient to address more urgent defensive needs and to prevent their complete disintegration. One of the most consequential moves was the redeployment and reassignment of formations originally intended as the spearhead's reinforcement. Where possible, armies were instructed to fall back to prepared lines, to reconstitute, and to prepare to defend the German interior, rather than risking annihilation in a far western salient. For the 6th Panzer Army, this meant a gradual but unmistakable shift. Units were pulled back, staff priorities refocused from offensive momentum to withdrawal routes and defensive fortifications. In effect, the transfer of key armored elements away from the offensive sealed the operation's fate. Without those mobile reserves, there could be no renewed push to Antwerp. This was not a neat, orderly process. The congested roads, confused signals, and the intermittent hope that clear weather might close again led to a patchwork of movements. Some units escaped relatively intact and were reorganized. Others were pressed into service in local counterattacks that accomplished little but cost more fuel and men. The cumulative effect was devastating for Germany's remaining strategic mobility. Where the Wehrmacht had once counted on armored corps to threaten deep operations, it now struggled to assemble locomotion sufficient even for local operations. After the Ardennes, the possibility of mounting another strategic offensive in the west was effectively foreclosed. Estimates compiled in the months after the campaign put the German toll in stark terms. Casualties, dead, wounded, and missing, are variously estimated, but clustered in the tens of thousands. Equipment losses included hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles rendered inoperative by battle damage, mechanical breakdown, or abandonment. Those figures, even when given as ranges, tell an unmistakable operational truth. The Germans paid heavily in men and material for a gamble that had failed to pay dividends. More consequential than any single number was the qualitative loss, the erosion of mobile reserves that could have been deployed in 1945 for either defensive or counteroffensive operations. The Ardennes had drained Germany of resources it could ill afford to lose. The human story threaded through these losses is poignant in its professional despair. Commanders accustomed to taking the initiative found themselves reduced to preservation. Dietrich, who had once stood at the head of spearheads and spoken of bold action, acknowledged in post-war statements that continuing the offensive in the face of destroyed supply corridors would have meant senseless slaughter of his troops. Manteuffel, always one of the clearest operational minds among the panzer commanders, recommended consolidation and withdrawal when it became apparent that the operational objective had no realistic fuel base.
Rundsted's post-war reflection that the High Command had known the limits beforehand read less as self-justification and more as an appeal to the plain arithmetic of warfare. Model's personal arc in the weeks that followed was emblematic of the broader tragedy. He worked incessantly to hold what could be held and to extract formations when that was the only option left. His orders, in those final days, often read like the instructions of a defensive strategist writing under duress. where to form successive lines, how to allocate scarce fuel to the most vital units, and how to organize withdrawals to avoid encirclement. He did not, in public, rail against Hitler. Instead, he performed his duties with a grim intensity. The strain showed. For Model and others who bore the responsibility of trying to reconcile political commands with operational necessity, the Ardennes was the defining failure of a late-war German generalship, a campaign whose costs outweighed its fleeting gains, and whose political origin made a rational military response more difficult than it needed to be. Once the withdrawal and reallocation orders took root, Allied pressure and the resumption of air interdiction accelerated the collapse of offensive momentum. Patton's forces, having been shifted westward to relieve Bastogne, began to press into the flanks of the salient. American artillery and armored counterattacks helped sever supply lines and amplified the already crippling effects of fuel shortages. German attempts to patch holes, emergency rail moves, desperate seizures of small fuel caches, and daring night movements could not replace the systematic logistical base required for sustained offensive action. The campaign came to an effective halt not with a single decisive battle, but by attrition of mobility and the administrative decision to redeploy armored formations where they could be used in a defensive posture. The political and symbolic cost of acknowledging failure at the highest level never fully dissipated. Hitler's refusal to concede publicly meant that many commanders still had to issue orders that preserved the facade of effort even while they implemented measures designed to reduce further losses. That dissonance between public commitment and private admission is at the heart of why historians find the leaders' reactions so telling. These men, trained for maneuver and decision in war, reacted not in dramatic revolts but in pragmatic rescues, pulling back units when they could, abandoning untenable positions, writing contingency plans, and in private, conceding what they could not say in public. The aftermath extended beyond December. German armored strength, already limited, was irreversibly diminished. Armies that might have been rotated, refitted, and recommitted were instead absorbed into defensive lines. Spare parts and trained crews were so depleted that replacement took months the Reich did not have.
The short-term disruption the offensive created for Allied logistics and operations paled next to the long-term strategic consequences for Germany. The Ardennes did not reverse the course of the war. If anything, it accelerated the erosion of Germany's remaining strategic flexibility. In the years after the conflict, participants reflected on the episode in a mixture of candor and obfuscation. Dietrich's post-war testimony captured the bitter candor of men who had watched material proof of failure, burned tanks, empty fuel drums, columns turned to wreckage, and then heard the unyielding voice of policy from Berlin. Rundstedt's later admission that they had known the limits beforehand reads as an indictment of political decision-making imposing an impossible objective. Mountefel's counsel and Model's calculations are preserved in memos and recollections that show a consistent threat. The operational reality had long been at odds with the Führer's ambition. That tension and its consequences framed the final judgment of the Ardennes gamble. The offensive had temporarily seized ground and surprised the Allies. It had inflicted shock and temporarily redirected Allied attention. But it had failed to secure any long-term strategic advantage and had bled the Wehrmacht of irreplaceable mobile reserves. The leaders' reactions, sarcasm at the front, private admissions among generals, and the constrained language of staff officers relaying bad news to the Führer were the human proof that the endeavor had been a catastrophic miscalculation. The final, tragic punctuation to the story of leadership under this strain came in the spring of 1945. Walter Model, who had tried to navigate impossible choices between orders and operational facts, took his own life in April 1945. His death has been read by historians not as a dramatic confession, but as the last anguished note in a career worn down by the contradiction of competence and command. Model's end underscores the human cost of decisions made at the intersection of political insistence and military reality. When historians return to December 23 and the days that followed, they do so not merely to recount routes and casualty lists, but to understand the moral geography of command under impossible pressure. The unbelievable reaction in the title is not a single line or an isolated outburst. It is the complex of responses that followed the clearing of that winter sky. Scornful resignation at the front, pragmatic reallocation by those charged with saving what remained, and the agonized, sometimes futile efforts of staff officers to make bad news acceptable to a man who demanded miracles.
Those reactions, recorded in memos, post-war statements, and the altered dispositions on the map, are the clearest evidence that the gamble had been called and failed. The Ardennes did not change the character of the war in a single instant.
It changed it by exhaustion, by stripping from Germany the offensive mobility that might, in different circumstances, have prolonged resistance or altered specific operations. The leaders' reactions, the private realizations, the weary sarcasm of commanders like Dietrich, the tactical conservatism of Montefel, Rundstedt's steady skepticism, Model's desperate calculations, and the constrained compliance of Jodl and Keitel are the human ledger of that exhaustion. If you found this breakdown revealing and want a deeper look at unit movements, first-person accounts, and the strategic maps that tell the same story visually, watch our full Battle of the Bulge deep dive playlist. Like and share to help us keep this kind of historical storytelling alive.